In this video, I'm going to talk about mainly the number one mistake that most people do when they run Facebook ads. And I'm not going to talk about it from a perspective of another marketing agency that's just trying to get you more leads that honestly end up not showing up or being qualified. I'm mainly going to talk about it from a sales perspective. So if you're in a position and you're trying to add in a new current funnel because you're in a position where maybe the funnel or social media stuff that you got going on right now isn't booking as many calls, you're trying to establish something new to make sure that you're scaling and getting new audiences and pockets of audiences, or you're in a position where you're just trying to find a product market fit with your offer and you know that you can help people, this video is for you. So mainly what we're going to talk about is tracking from a sales perspective, and it's going to be something different that most people don't really talk about, and how you actually view things from a macro level. And I'm going to give about two specific things and a bonus tip as well. Right. So currently you might be in a position where, you're running ads, you have some sort of funnel, you're taking it to a landing page and you're booking calls, right? Or lack thereof, right? In most scenarios. And you feel like you're spending lots of money and you go back to, you know, the whiteboard or the chalkboard, as they say, and you're like, all right, like, let me just try to make sure that I can redo my landing page or change things up with the ads and, trying to get this number to go up. And then you get a lot of no shows and you kind of go in these circles and you're just going into this endless cycle. And again, I'm not going to be like another, it's not going to be another video where we're going to talk about like, how to have better creatives to increase your click through rate or do all these variations. What I'm really going to talk about are the levers from a sales perspective that actually matter, right? So the first thing that we really want to actually track from a sales perspective is what's the actual cost per book call. And a lot of times what people end up doing is they end up having a cost per book call that ends up being super high. And they never really know how to actually fix this. And their main intention or their main habit to go through is to just look at the ads and try to switch up variations, when in reality, it's probably something else, right? But let's just give a scenario, right? Say your program's $5,000. You have $100 per book call. Great, right? 80% show up rate. Great. And you have a 30% close rate. So after doing those numbers, 100 divided by 0.8, then divided by 0.3, you'll get that you're actually getting $416 per sale for a $5,000 program. And essentially, in this great, wonderful, magical world, right, you're making 10x. And there's no reason why you shouldn't be, putting more money into, this funnel, because, hey, you're making 10x, just, put more budget and just scale. Right. But what ends up happening is, in most cases, the cost per book call ends up being too high. Or in most cases, what ends up happening is you don't even have any book calls. And one of the main reasons that I always say, or the main levers, is mainly these three things, right? And I'm going to give a little bonus tip here. The offer means that people aren't really wanting to actually book a call. You have to think of different types of creatives than just a typical video scripts that you end up having. And the landing page isn't also congruent with the offer and the creative. But what I believe is mainly the biggest lever is the offer, right? And so I always say this in other videos, that you want to have an enticing offer. Nothing beats an enticing offer that people can actually see that they can get results, or they want to get results, because that is the biggest lever for people to actually not only book calls, but for actually to show up. And then the quality game is mainly, seeing if they have finances, and you can kind of be specific on the type of, things that you put on the creative to focus on, financial qualifiers or things on the form, right? But when you're thinking of an offer, you're not really thinking the same thing that most people do. The same 90-day, or we'll give you your money back, or pay $5,000, or, we're going to get you XYZ result, in 16 weeks, and we'll work with you for free, so on and so forth. What you really want to think of is, what's the best way to put your results on the line, and making sure that you can be in a position where you're more quote unquote at risk, but not really, because you know that you can get them results. And so when you think of these types of offers, in most cases, things that work really well are the trials, the challenges, the risk freeze, and things like that, mainly because now you're actually putting your fulfillment on the line. But if they get the result first, then there's no reason why they won't want to book that call. Now, that's one of the biggest drivers to actually drop the cost per book call, because then you don't need to have the fanciest, creatives, or the fanciest, funnels, or all these different, automations that people talk about. I mean, simply the offer can be something that really, really, really entices people to really just want to go straight to booking that call. Right. Another bonus tip along with this that I just added, honestly, before putting this video, is you also want to make sure that when you're running meta ads, that you're running different awareness levels. And what I mean by that is most people just try to focus on product aware, meaning they're just putting their offer out there like, hey, like you want this, great, take it. You want this, great, take it. When in reality, the product aware and most aware people only really take up 3% of the actual market, right? About 60 to 70% of the market is actually in other levels that I like actually really going to, and that's really problem and solution aware, right? So if you actually start focusing on those markets with different hooks and really researching, and guys, you can do this with ChatGPT, like what is solution, problem aware, and you start thinking of the angles and hooks that you can actually reach these people with your creatives, you're also going to open up the market more to actually lower the cost per book call, instead of just going to the most aware, most product aware, which you're only really trying to fight 3% of people who are essentially ready. And then that game gets old, because then that market really, just dries out. Right. Another thing that I always say, when it comes to, again, this is like the second to third lever amongst the offer and the awareness levels to, bring that cost per book call down, is just random ugly image ads like that you can create on Canva with like a red background and like a white font or a yellow font, or a black background with like, a lime green font. Like those things like are so different, and they're so like unpolished. Even things like vertical videos on your iPhone, like rant style, they're so unpolished that people appreciate the rawness of, even webinar style, like things that you can just share your screen and it's like not a super fancy camera. And like people appreciate that, at least right now, because there's this wave, probably 4 or 5 years ago, where like things weren't as edited and that was the norm. And then things got so hyper edited, and then people were liking that for a period of time. But then now there's kind of just everybody's doing the same thing. So if you're like on your phone or on your desktop and you're seeing this like fancy, like super hyper edited, people are just tired of that stuff. They just kind of want like the real, raw, boring stuff that can actually help them. And if you have the offer with the awareness levels, with kind of just raw, like boring, like not as polished stuff, people are just going to believe you. I mean, it's just, you have to think of the psychology of that, of like, oh, like, hey, that makes sense, right? And then they're going to want to book a call, right? And kind of my last tip with here is, you want the landing page to just be simple and just congruent, right? There's a lot of big guys in the space who literally just have like a white background, black font, and just like a form, right? And again, like, I'm not saying that the other, landing pages like might be a little bit better, but if you're thinking about like your time and really trying to see like the fastest way to get a product market fit, it doesn't have to be crazy. It doesn't have to be this like big, super like long form videos everywhere, like all this stuff. It's like, it could just be super simple, black and white, and just like, here's what it is, apply, book a call, right? So just to wrap it up, I mean, the main 2 points here is have an offer that gives a result first, that puts your results on the line, and try to tap into different awareness levels, more into the problem and solution aware, instead of just the most aware and product aware that only encapsulate about 3% of the actual market. Those are actually the bigger levers, instead of just all the media buying hacks and all these different things that you can do to actually drive the cost per book call down, if hypothetically you're within these numbers, right? So I'm going to talk about that now, right? Because this scenario is actually super nice if you're in this, scenario here. But let's go on to the second, portion of this, right? So the second thing that you really want to track, because again, we're actually trying to make sure that these ads are profitable so that we can scale, right? And so I'm kind of giving you the front end type of ideas that can lower the cost per book call in that scenario of the 80% book call and then the 30% close rate, or 80% show rate and 30% close rate, not book call, right? But now what I'm going to do is really talk about the numbers that really help with the 80% show up rate and the 30% close rate. Because hypothetically, and I'm just kind of doing the math here, right? If we have, a 30% show up rate and a 10% close rate, I'm not going to do the math right now, but I would highly assume that, $460 per sale skyrockets to $1,000, $2,000, $3,000 plus, and then it's not as profitable when you try to scale. Right. So the second thing we want to establish and track mainly is the sales process. Right. So I always say these are the two numbers that we want to focus on: the 70 to 80% show up rate and at least a 30% close rate. Why is this important? Right. Because if I at least have a 70 to 80% show up rate and at least a 30% close rate, that shows that most people are actually interested through my process to actually show up to the call. Meaning I can scale this with a team of salespeople, because no closer wants to come in with the 40% show up rate. They'll come in and they'll leave, faster than you actually think. And then they actually won't, tell you why, but then you'll find out why later. And you also want to make sure that there's a minimum 30% close rate. And, obviously the closing frameworks and stuff have to be in place, but there needs to also be people that show up that are quality, right? So it can't just be show up low quality or, super low and then higher quality. You want to have both of them to be in a good standing, right? So how do we influence this, right? How do we influence making sure that we have a 70 to 80% show up rate? Because that affects the numbers here, right? So the first thing that I always say is you want to make sure that you do speed to lead and confirmation calls, right? Whether you're taking it to a setter, whether you're taking it to a closer, you want to make sure that you have a conversation with the people who book calls. Now, I'm not just saying that this is a plug and play for everybody. This is just a high recommendation to most offers, right? Because there's some offers that they come on very B2B, like it makes sense, blah, blah, blah. But in most cases, if you're running it to a cold audience, you want to have these, quick 5 to 10 minutes confirmation calls. And you want to be able to make sure that you have the highest pickup rate by doing speed to lead. Now, this is super important, right, for feedback, because when you're running ads, say you have the offer, say you have, all those levers I said in the first place, you want to make sure that you can actually listen to the people who are on the phone, right? Automations, email sequences, videos, that's great, right? But you're never going to know how somebody actually is in regards to quality, intent, and urgency, more than just actually having a conversation and actually hearing the sound when you ask them questions, hearing their tonality and their feedback and their responses, right? So the three things that you're looking for when it comes to these confirmation calls, right? Quick ones, quick 5 to 10 minute ones, is what is their intent, right? Like, do they have a high buying intent or a low buying intent? Are they skeptical, or, can you just nurture them to show up to the call? What is their sense of urgency? And what I mean by that is not the sense of urgency of like, I have to be proactive, but what is the sense of urgency in regards to the pain that they have? Is it something that they want to actually, fix now? Or are they kind of just like, yeah, 6 months, 12 months kind of seems like fair to me. How are you going to sell somebody there, right? And then what does their financial situation look like? Are there any financial red flags when it comes to those conversations? Again, in those conversations, it doesn't have to be super, like, do you have $5,000? It could just be like, God, and like, what do you do for work at the moment? Like, what is your financial situation? Are you in a position where you may be open to actually, talking about what it looks like to invest in yourself to actually reach XYZ goal, right? It doesn't have to go super like, do you have $5,000 right now? It's more so, are they in that position, right? A couple other things that you can do, and I've talked about this in other videos, is having retargeting videos. Just do a 7-day or a 30-day window. 7 days if it's, book call, and you just give them some value videos, give them some FAQs, and give them some objections, even testimonials, so that when they're on their phone, on their laptop, they can also see other things as well, to be like, oh, like this is legit, and I never knew this person, had a testimonial like this, or hey, that is probably an objection that I have, but I didn't really say it on the call, but that helps me to kind of want to show up to the call, right? These are kind of like secondary things that, it's not really trackable, but we've seen it actually help to increase the show up rate, because you're giving them all these different points of contact that actually help support on the back, on the back end, right? Another thing, obviously, now that we're switching to kind of the close rate, is the closing frameworks. Now, this is different for every, type of offer and industry and avatar. But what I typically say is what is the tonality that you're using? What is the pitch? What are the objections? And mainly what I always say is, what type of frame do you have when you're on a call? Right? Are you a pushover, someone who's like super friendly? Now, I'm not saying you have to be like a jerk on the call, but to the avatar and industry that you have, what are the type of, what's a frame that you bring onto the call so that you're leading the call? And a lot of people don't talk about this too. Two more points of this: how you handle objections on the front end, instead of just trying to, drop a price and then handle objections for 20, 30 minutes. And then lastly, how are you being creative with different price anchors and the way that you're pitching your price, right? And what I mean by that, and I've said this in other videos too, is if you're selling something for 5,000, and just saying like, hey, work with me, the program, the price for the program is $5,000 for 12 weeks. And then you just, don't talk, versus like, well, typically to work one-on-one with the owner is 25,000. But we found that they, with a group model where there's other people helping each other out, we found higher success rates in that perspective. And so we have most people go along with that program for just $5,000, and it creates this perception of more value, right? So some of the things that you want to track when it comes to this process that affect the actual, show up rate and the close rate is, how many people are you actually, setting to close, and how many people are you actually setting to show as well? So if you're having these confirmation calls, what is the actual perspective and numbers that you have when you're reaching out to them, and how many of those are actually showing up and closing with confirmation calls? You can also use these numbers for people who are like, filling out the form, so on and so forth, right? And then amongst that, with the, the forms and all the other things, what are you doing with speed to lead, and also the number of follow-ups? That's kind of just like secondary and tertiary, right? So the second number to track, right, in this kind of perspective, because I know it kind of was like all over the place, is show up rate percentage, and then also close rate percentage through the confirmation calls and also through the closing frameworks, right? Again, I'm talking from a sales perspective, guys. I'm not talking as another marketing agency trying to get you more leads, right? So just to recap, right, the two main things that are going to help is, what's your cost per book call, which is influenced by the offer and also the awareness levels that you're actually running ads to. And then what are your sales metrics when it comes to the show up rate percentage and close rate, in which that you're establishing confirmation calls and also the closing frameworks, right? Now, these two main things are probably the biggest levers to make sure that you can have the lowest cost per book call and then the highest ROAS. But let's go a little bit further as we go on to different numbers, right? So say you're in a position where you're doing 3x or 4x or 2x or whatever, right? And now you're in a position where you're like, great, everything's going great. I'm scaling my ads, but you want to squeeze out even more, right? Let's put a hypothetical scenario that you're actually just above break even. You're like, oh man, like I want to scale, but I don't know how, right? Because like I'm kind of just battling this and I'm going back and forth. One of the other unknown things that most people don't talk about, because they only talk about, creatives and, lowering your cost per lead, is how can you actually increase your lifetime value of your clients, right? So this is more fulfillment based, right? And so one of the biggest things that you can do is if you have a 12 to 16 week program, not client, right? But client, but yeah, you know what I mean. You want to look at the main drivers of success and results that actually help people to actually get that type of result, right? So let's just break it down to like a fitness and nutrition offer. It's like, what are the main things? Is it the coaching calls? Is it, making sure that they're going to the gym consistently? Is it that, they have to, go grocery shopping every Sunday and Saturday and have their meal preps, right? And so you want to track those things as the biggest things that actually bring the biggest levers to actually get people results. And so within that process, let's say you have a 90-day program, 12-week program, you want to establish activation points, right? So you want to say like, okay, if I get this person by day 30 to reach this type of result with this habit, and then by day 60, and then by day 90, they graduate, what can I do to actually track and optimize those activation points? So if, Joe Schmo, if he does XYZ by 30 days, then that means he's going to go here through 60 days. And then by 90 days, he's going to graduate and reach those results. How can I get Joe Schmo to always make sure that we're optimized to reach day 30, day 60, and day 90, right? And so what you're going to do in that position is now you're going to have control of every client coming in, being able to track, right, the success of the client through the activation points and optimize those numbers and those long-term results as well. And so what you can do, before they actually graduate is, now that you have a handle of the results, you can downsell for 12 months, or you can upsell for, this is mainly like B2B, like a higher ticket price of like, we made you, we got you to reach this, result through, this many clients. So like now our higher ticket is XYZ for another 6 months, right? And so what you can do there is, now I'm going to go a little bit specific with numbers, right? If you have a 2X, right, so you're getting $2,500 to get a client, and it's $5,000, for them to pay that for, to you, that's 2X, $225 per sale. But now you end up increasing the LTV. Your 2X can be largely influenced if you change that to, $2,500, and they end up paying you, an extra 5 or 10 grand because they end up staying with you for 12 months, or an extra 6 months for a higher ticket. Now you're squeezing out the most that you can per client, and then you can dump more money into the front end of ads to scale so that you can actually be profitable and scale to the next level, right? So the three main things here that I mainly talked about that are super helpful are, what is a cost per book call that is mainly influenced by the offer and the solution and the awareness levels through the front end of ads? What are the sales processes that you're establishing that influences these numbers, the show up rate and the close rate? Again, these two numbers actually affect the cost per book call. And then what are you doing as a bonus tip to increase your lifetime value by also tracking the results of each client through activation points, so that you can even increase that ROAS even more, right? And so if you're in a position and you feel like you've heard a lot of things of different people talking about different tracking metrics, right? And let me just kind of scroll here in the main way. I would highly advise that you start thinking of tracking in this specific way, because now you're not coming from a, how can I just lower my cost per lead? You're coming from what does my prospect want, and how can I implement a sales process so that I lower my book call through what my prospect wants and through the sales process, those two main things. How can I track those things? And then how can I make sure that my prospect actually starts getting results and track that so that they can stay with me longer? And if you think about it, the frameworks and that way of what you're tracking is more actually thinking about the prospect instead of you just trying to get the most, like cost per book call to lower it down from another perspective. You're actually thinking, what does my prospect want? and how does my prospect think, and how will they show up to the call, and how will they stay with me longer, because you're giving them what they want, right? So hopefully this has helped, and I'll see you on the next video.